Hey folks, it's Nate, and thanks for dropping by the art table today. I wanted to talk a little bit about a new topic, something I've only talked about a little bit on this channel so far, but something that has had a real influence on the ways I think about characters and stories over the course of my life. That's tabletop role-playing games. Now, I started probably, about 17 or 18 years ago, not quite that much, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood, playing pen and paper role-playing games with friends at college. And even before I settled on writing as a career, I knew that there was something there that really appealed to me. Part of it, of course, was just the mechanics. Role-playing games appeal to me as a geek and somebody obsessed with details. But there's also something about the storytelling element that really appealed to me. I know it appeals to a lot of people in these days and age, just given the success of things like Critical Role and other role-playing game podcasts. Now, these really don't encapsulate the experience of playing a role-playing game yourself, and that's pretty important, but they do kind of give some of the appeal to a broader audience, and I know that's led to a spike in popularity, both good and bad. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what I learned from playing these games so that people can hopefully draw the same lessons, because they're not the lessons that I think a lot of people get from them. I'm going to do a number of these videos, but I want to start by talking about mechanics and story. Every tabletop role-playing game has mechanics that factor in a number of things. Players don't always get to have their way, and the basics of those mechanics are including elements like the efforts of the opposition and random chance into whether or not what you as a player wants to do actually happens, or even in the case of the game master, who is really just a player as well, whether what the game master wants to happen happens. And these mechanics are a very big part of what gives a role-playing game its flavor and its structure. People don't think about these mechanics a whole lot, I've noticed. Especially players, but even game masters have a tendency to just think of them as tools to get done whatever it is they want to get done. They don't think of them as a part of the story, and that's not great. Now, when role-playing games started back in the day with the original Dungeons & Dragons, that's not terribly surprising. They were just taking a wargaming board game and they were turning it into an engine to tell stories with, but they still had this idea of wargaming hanging over the experience, and it factored into a lot of their decisions, and you can really see it in that early system, which was kind of, well, for starters, it wasn't balanced, it was kind of clunky. It had ideas like THAC0, which is great for a war game where stats don't change over the course of the game, but not so great for something like Dungeons & Dragons, where you expect your characters to grow a great deal, possibly beyond what the bounds of a system like THAC0 is really designed to handle simply and elegantly. However, we're not here to talk about simplicity versus complexity right now. We're talking about story and mechanics. And these mechanics reflected the story in a very simplistic way. They created a binary pass-fail state that was informative about what your character did or did not do, but wasn't very flavorful. What do I mean by that? Well, as your character got better at stuff, his numbers get bigger or smaller in the case of AC in those early days. And that's it. That's all that really happens. And it's not really surprising for a first-pass role-playing game. As time went on, other layers of mechanics would be added, and a lot of players would eventually find that those layers of mechanics kind of got in the way of dealing with the story elements that they wanted to do. So they took them back out, and they just sort of hand-waved it, and there was a lot of discussion around the table, and eventually the group would come to a consensus and they would move on. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are mechanics that can help you see more clearly what your character is and what the world around them is and how they're interacting with it. And there are role-playing games that have these mechanics that implement them in very interesting ways that don't get away in the way of playing, but rather inform you playing the game. The perfect example of that, I think, is the Force die from the Star Wars Fantasy Flight role-playing game. This is a really interesting thing. Every time you take an action as a Force-sensitive character, you have to roll this die, and you can enhance your action using the pips that the die shows. So if it shows 1 pip, you could add a +1 to certain variables in your Force ability. If it shows 2 pips, you can add 2. However, there's a catch to it. You see, some of the pips are light side pips and some of the pips are dark side pips. Every time you use a Force pip that matches your kind of the Force, whether you are a Sith using dark Jedi powers or whether you are a Jedi using light side powers, those pips can sway you, as it were. Just like a Jedi or a Sith, your emotions color the way you use the Force. And if you roll your die and dark side pips come up, that means if you use the Force to enhance your action here, you're going to be enhancing it in a Sith fashion rather than a Jedi fashion. And that can alter the way other Jedi perceive you. It can weaken your connection to the light side of the Force and strengthen your connection to the dark side of the Force. There are all kinds of repercussions to that. That's very interesting. That is a mechanic that influences the way you play the game. But it's even deeper than that. You see, the Force die has 12 sides to it. 7 of those sides have dark side symbols on them. 5 of them have light side symbols on them. Now that's interesting because we know that the dark side is faster, easier, and more seductive. You don't have to use the Force that shows up on your Force die when you roll the Force die to activate a Force power. That's optional. It gives you a small benefit. And the dark side is more likely than not to be there tempting you to grab that extra bit of power because it's faster, it's easier, it's more seductive. However, and this is the really interesting part, there are more double light side point faces than there are dark side point faces. So if you total them all up, there's a total of 8 light side pips and 8 dark side pips on the die in total. It is in fact balanced, just as the Force is. Very fascinating. This is a mechanic that reinforces the story and the world building just through the number of faces printed on a die. That's brilliant. That is good storytelling. That is something you can take away about the kind of world you're in and the kind of morality that it presents you with just by reading a page about mechanics and looking at the die. Very few role-playing games do this. Very few storytellers do this. But if you really dig deep into the mechanical parts of your story, the way a supernatural ability works, or the way relationships are laid out, or the way a company goes about doing business, you can reflect things about your characters and your world through the way you build these things. And that is a lesson I took away very early on from playing role-playing games and thinking about stories. There are very few things as succinct and as excellent as the Force die in role-playing games. I can think of some things that attempt a similar outcome. The White Wolf system plays around systems, plural, I should say, because they're not exactly the same system across the board. But it plays around a lot with the idea of overlapping skill potentials. And it uses ever-growing dice pools to represent that in a more organic way, I think, than just the ever-growing bonuses of a system like Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the White Wolf systems have their own problems, and they are significant. But the mechanics show how a very competent person can still fail and do so with a greater regularity than a system like, say, Dungeons & Dragons can reflect, in my opinion. Again, there are a bunch of systems that do this. I'm not interested in breaking them all down. I'm more interested in encouraging writers to think about how the mechanics of their world directly illustrate the kinds of themes they are trying to put in their story, the kind of arcs they are trying to give their characters. A lot of times, especially in the fantasy genre, people just dream up a set of mechanics and then they map on their story on top of them, which is fine. Brandon Sanderson does a great job playing around with things like allomancy and the shard blades and things like that. But he also puts a lot of effort into thinking about his softer forms of magic to play up these themes. And I think a lot of writers, especially these days, are doing themselves a disservice if they're not taking advantage of the potential of fantasy to, especially, but really any genre, to be custom built to tell a story rather than built strictly along the cause and effect lines of what is most quote unquote effective or what is expected or what is standard. Don't be married to a system of magic or a system of structuring a corporation or even a set of relationships between characters as prescribed by what you perceive to be the correct politics or the correct roles in society or any of these things. Try and tailor them to your characters and the arcs you are trying to give them. Make the mechanics reflect the story in that really, really handcrafted way the Force die reflects the way the Force works in Star Wars. That way you can get maximum impact from those elements in your story when they come up. An example of this, a really great example of this, is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The ghosts in A Christmas Carol have a set of powers that makes no sense in folklore, that makes no sense in... Well, okay, it makes sense in folklore now just because A Christmas Carol has gone on to become such a deep and integral part of the Western canon. But at the time it was written, what his ghosts do don't really make any kind of logical sense. They don't make any thematic sense. I mean, you don't associate Christmas with time travel. Yet, Ebenezer Scrooge needed to understand his life and the impact his decisions was going to have on himself and others. So Dickens built that story around that goal. And he gave the ghosts not the powers of your typical hauntings in a story. He gave them the powers they needed to reach Scrooge. And yes, they were consistent in those powers, most notably with the Ghost of Christmas Past, who could be extinguished and eventually was extinguished by Scrooge in a way that strongly represents how hard Scrooge was trying to forget his past. And this made the story much more effective, simply because Dickens was not constrained by the way ghosts normally work and what would be expected of them. Of course, there are a lot of other important elements in here. You still have to be consistent within your own rules. You still have to think about how much your audience is going to track with them. All of these things are important, and I'm going to talk about them going forward. However, right now, for this first video on the Table Talk part of Art Table Talk, I thought we would simply look at the importance of putting thought not just into the mechanics of your story, but in how those mechanics marry with the narrative. Far too many people think, well, there's a set of physical actions that are happening in my story, and those are the physical actions, and we have to keep those separate from the characters and their emotional arcs and all these other things. That's bunk. The closer you can weave those two together, the better your story will be. Just as the closer you can get your mechanics in an RPG to mirror the way the world actually works, the more satisfying it will be to play that game. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed that. Let me know what you think about this new kind of storytelling discussion down in the comments below. There's a like button and subscribe button you can use as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.